This is Bonjour, the Misconceptia Edition. I am not Avi Feingold in Montreal. I am Zac Kauffman in Toronto with Phoebe, Maltz, Bovy. We are your stable maples. We are your eager beavers. We are your frozen chosen. Today on the show, we talk about how the war in Israel and Gaza has forced us to update our priors. What was our mental model? What conceptia, as the Israelis say, were we living under about the Jewish state and its neighbors until now? And how has it changed over the past 14 days? All that right after this message.
Are you in the market for a new watch or a special piece of jewelry? Are you looking for the perfect engagement ring to pop the question? Atelier Lou has all this and more. Eric and the team at Atelier Lou can craft a piece for you, or you can select from some of the exclusive designers that they offer. From a simple bangle to a statement necklace, Atelier Lou can make you or your loved ones sparkle. Located in the heart of Westmount in Montreal or online at atelierlou.com, visit Atelier Lou for your next watch or jewelry purchase. And when you do, make sure to use promo code BON18 for 10% off your next purchase. That's atelierlou.com.
I would say I'm happy to be here, but given the news, so I've been hearing a lot about how you're supposed to check in with your Jewish friends, colleagues, neighbors, and whatnot at this time. So, Zac, I hear you're Jewish. I know I am as well, but nevertheless, got to check in with you. How are you doing?
The truth is, I am feeling a little bit like an emotionally waterlogged sponge. Although I have heard that you're not supposed to say, "How are you doing?" to people. I've heard complaints on the internet of people getting to the office on Monday morning and non-Jewish colleagues saying like, "Hey, how was your weekend? How you doing?" And people not appreciating that. People
really?
would have rather them say like, "How are you holding up?" Like to acknowledge that, this isn't a normal thing.
But so this is
what about
I
that
think,
fascinates you?
Yes. Well, I'll tell you. So this means that we're going to jump ahead to sort of one of our subtopics, which is this question of should people be checking in with their Jewish friends at this time? Or indeed, are people even still talking about that? Or as the news cycle, are people even still thinking of Jews as the marginalized minority of the moment? That's a separate question. But this whole idea of like checking in with your friends of a particular background, this really took hold, I think, during the kind of 2020 reckonings, right? That you were supposed to, if you were not Black yourself, check in with Black people you knew, which always struck me as like, it seemed questionable that like random Black people in any non-Black person's life would necessarily want this and not feel just kind of put on the spot. And so now, okay, I've now been on a bit of the receiving end of this and I can speak a bit to this, and I think I would be okay with a "how was your weekend," given that I live in Toronto, where there is not currently a war. Doesn't mean there never could be, but there isn't right now.
It sounds like you have had people reach out to you, non-Jewish people, knowing you're a Jew, saying, like, "How are you doing?" How does that feel to receive those messages?
I mean,
does it feel comforting? Does it feel true?
I haven't received as much as some have. I'm never sure the main thing it makes me think is how extremely Jewish I read to people who aren't Jewish, which, okay, I mean, I work for the CJN. It's not going to be like a huge surprise to me, like that I'm Jewish and that people know that. But I don't really know what I'm supposed to say because like...
Well, what's the truth?
The truth is that I am not a big fan of every time I log onto my computer, which I need to do, for work purposes and just for general life purposes, seeing dead Jewish babies. I'm not a fan of seeing any dead babies of any background either. I hasten to add.
So it sounds like the truth is you are having a tough time.
I would say it's tough, but I wouldn't say that but I also think though that like what I am doing in a week by week basis is still like my life and not the news cycle, and I'm like more preoccupied with stuff to do with like my own family, my own work, things like that, than I am with like I think that there's a danger in pretending that everybody is more emotionally connected to world events happening not near them than they are to whatever they are personally dealing with. Like you can care in different ways about different things. I don't know if that makes sense.
That makes sense. The thing that it makes me think about is sort of hyphenated identities. the way that I'm coming at it is thinking about, like, people obviously don't like to be thought of as a black doctor, as a woman lawyer. And does messaging your Jewish friend when something happens in Israel, is that sort of signaling that you don't really see them as a regular American or a regular Canadian, that they're really some sort of other?
There's been a lot of discussion of kind of, is it fair? Like you don't want to conflate Israel with Jews, you do all of this. People say this, but then, like, at the same time, a huge number of Jews in the diaspora have, personal connections, not to Israel in some abstract way necessarily, maybe, but also to just like actual Israeli Jews who are their own family members and whatnot. And because of Jewish history and how it went, basically, like, even if you are a Jew not of Middle Eastern origin, your family is going to be basically like split between very often, Europe or North America and Israel. And that's just often how it goes demographically. So it's not necessarily some kind of like weird sort of either dual loyalties or whatever sort of thing to assume that somebody Jewish cares about Israel, nor does it necessarily mean that that person considers themselves a Zionist. Now, sort of like, I thought it would be interesting to talk about a bit is just sort of like how we both kind of came to this topic, like where we were at sort of politically, personally, whatever, with regards to Israel, Zionism, Israeli-Palestinian conflicts and all of this.
I mentioned this up top. One way that it's framing for me is something that in the Israeli media people are talking about, is this idea of the shattering of what they call the conceptia. And it's a word that goes back to 50 years ago. In the wake of the Yom Kippur War, there was this thing, the Agranat Commission, and they said that the leaders in politics and the military were all under this, what they called the conceptia, which was at the time that Sadat would never engage in a war that he wouldn't win, and that the other surrounding countries would never go into a war without the Egyptians. And then the parallels today are obvious, that everyone thought Israel had the biggest, baddest army in the world. The Mossad was all-seeing, this Eye of Sauron. They had billion-dollar fences and the Iron Dome. So the Israeli conceptia was shattered. And I think we all had our own sort of preconceptions that we were living under that were also shattered by this.
Mm-hmm. Or not, I think, but let's or explore.
Not, or reinforced. Yeah, totally.
But how about more like broadly, like what had been your general sort of stance regarding these topics? What engaged, not engaged, semi-engaged, and on what front? Like,
right.
Yeah.
I grew up in a very Jewish world. I grew up going to Jewish day schools during 8 months of the year, and then I went to Camp Ramah for the other 2. So I was very much bathed in Jewish stuff and very invested in my Jewish identity. As I got older, I started leaning into this idea of, I'm very invested in my Judaism. I'm not so invested in nationalism, this like falafel IDF thing since 1948. I feel very grounded and rooted in Judaism that is international. Then I ended up, for totally non-ideological, just for job reasons, I ended up moving to Israel for 2 years. And that shifted me towards thinking about that, yes, if I care about my Judaism, the fact is half of the world's Jews live in Israel. And if you are someone who cares about Jewish culture, Jewish politics, Jewish whatever, if you care about Jewish people, half the world's people live in Israel. You have to be at least Israel interested. And how about yourself? Did you grow up in a deeply Zionist invested environment? And
no,
did that change for you over your arc?
Yeah. So for me, not really. I mean, I guess we did one family trip to Israel. Like we did a tour when I was 8, and there was not much discussion of Israel in general, I would say, over the years during my New York City childhood.
Did you ever think of Israel as home?
I don't think I've ever thought of Israel as home. No, but that's a separate, yeah. But basically, I started college. I went to the University of Chicago for undergrad. I started days after 9/11, and I was in Manhattan, where I grew up, then, and that certainly like made an impression and probably somewhat shaped my politics of that moment. That combined with then moving from New York to, yes, Chicago, but still the Midwest, and a lot of the students were just from, like around the Midwest, and being in a lot of very non-Jewish environments, I got exposed to a lot more views of sort of like Israel shouldn't exist at all. It's, a colonial entity. It's terrible, and just generally sort of at that same time also learn about the Dreyfus Affair and sort of 19th century French Jewish history. And I started to just become this like utterly bizarre, like late 19th century, secular Zionist living, in 21st century Chicago, then New York. And I don't know, like I definitely had this kind of politics emerging that wasn't necessarily that tied with the present day all the time, if that makes sense. So I was very interested in certain things that didn't all like translate to being very much like the most on top of the front page news of all people. I was never like a wonk or a pundit in that way.
Can you explain what that was? When you say that, like, you were influenced by the Dreyfus Affair, what ideas from that felt impactful? Yeah,
I mean, I was thinking, like, this idea of Jews being as entitled as anyone else to a nation state, and the idea that, like, if you think it's ethical for there to be France, which is, like, culturally French, why can there not be like a culturally Jewish, to use that expression, place one in the world? I was also very influenced, and this is more in grad school, not in college because I hadn't heard of him yet, but by Albert Memmi, he died in 2020 at age 99, French Tunisian Jewish writer who wrote about sort of Zionism as itself a form of anti-colonial struggle, sort of like a decolonization, liberation style movement, but for Jews. Like, that influenced me a lot. Definitely, I've never been religious or anything like that. It was more just this kind of, there ought to be a Jewish homeland. There is one. That's a good thing. I did and do consider myself a Zionist. And then when I think ahead, aside from the 19th century, but I think about the 20th century, I think, okay, well, where were Jews supposed to go, right? Where were Jews supposed to go? So basically, those were all my thoughts. I'm talking about like in my like late teens, early 20s. And then what happened was I just found the whole thing so extremely depressing and started thinking about other topics more and these topics less. And I work in other areas, like I do cultural commentary in other areas, and I am as far as can be really from like a Mideast pundit. I don't see scenes of devastation and scan for who or for which type of which type of weapon clearly did this. I scan for like the images of dead children and get very upset, basically. So that's sort of where I'm at with things like this.
I relate to that checking out when I talked about that phase of my life, like I'm interested in my Judaism, not so interested in Zionism. Part of that came out of this university experience I had, where in that community of people who were talking about Israel issues, somehow it became all about us. And every group that put out a statement and then responded to that statement, and you had to have a million meetings, and we talked about what the other ones talked about at their meetings, and not about the people there. It felt very navel-gazy and a little bit silly. And I think coming out of that environment made me also throw up my hands a little and feel like this isn't for me.
Yeah. No, I can totally see that. I mean, I think it's easier to focus on like statements, creating a statement, who put what in their statement, who phrased what in which way. That's like a lot easier to think about than like war, I suppose. So I think I can kind of understand at this time why a lot of people's minds are going to sort of parsing things rather than, I don't know. I mean, what I keep thinking about though is on the sort of bigger picture front, what it means about Israel as a refuge, as this kind of, if it gets terrible elsewhere, there's always Israel. And as this place to sort of save Jews from pogroms when I mean, I remember thinking about this. I was in, I'm going to completely mispronounce Rehovot, right? Or Rehovot, or Rehovot.
Well, it depends where you were. You know,
I was in.
If you were in Rehovot, then if you were in Jerusalem, it's the wrong pronunciation.
I was actually in Mississauga, and but then would go into Tel Aviv, just like, and there was a market that we would go to sometimes, and then it was attacked while we were there or shortly after or something. I just remember it did make me already start thinking like that the safety idea of Israel seemed already like a little like a complicated thing. But I still would say that at that time I thought, okay, well, maybe even if on a day-to-day basis you're safer in Canada or wherever, there's still like you're in a Jewish state, and that you're, you know, like there's this sort of Jewish self-defense going on. There's some kind of importance to that. And it's just the sheer level of devastation. It's just, it's hard to think of Israel right now as a safe harbor for Jews, right? I mean, apart from everything else. Like,
no, I totally agree. And when I think about where is it safe to be a Jew, before this conflict, when people said like, we need Israel because of the Jews need a safe place to go, I would think, well, how many Jews in Toronto do you know that have had to run to bomb shelters? How many Jews in Toronto do you know who look at a bag someone left on the bus and like get worried? Like in Toronto, we don't have to arm all our Jewish 18-year-olds and send them to the front lines. The idea that Israel, where you're going to put all these Jews in the middle of hostile countries, is the safest place to be a Jew in the world. It doesn't reflect a lot of people's experience, and especially today. And you see everyone trying to get out of Israel. Saying this critique feels yucky. It feels like I'm kicking someone while they're down, and is a little bit victim blamey.
In terms of safety, I mean, I think there's a difference between safety, like physical safety, and you could say like there's a value to, you know, a Jewish state that's different from specifically physical safety. But yeah, I think this specific war has like changed the sort of ratio of all of this. But just say in terms of like, has this shifted my priors? I feel like a little bit now, like I'm about to be one of those people who posts like, unfollow me now if, you know, I never do that, but I feel like saying a bit, and this has to do with like who I interact with, and it's going to be very different than like maybe who some listeners interact with probably, but I just want to say like, you know, unfollow me if somebody who like cares about Israel in any capacity is abhorrent to you, because that's who you're looking at. You know, if somebody who identifies as any kind of Zionist, even not a right-wing one, even not one who likes Netanyahu in the least, even one who has a lot of criticisms of Israel, who's, you know, if any sort of Zionist is too much for you, unfollow me now. I've been very tempted to do that, and
Sounds like that comes with, like, shame for me. Does that come with shame?
No, I mean, it comes with that I don't like to see any deaths, right? Like I'm not somebody who's like, yeah, you go get him in Gaza. Like, no, it's horrible. You know what I mean? And I think there are people who that's maybe less central, but but I did want to talk though about this thing, the way that what I've seen, I don't know if you've seen this so much. Yeah. I've seen a lot of people kind of funneling this whole discussion, the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, I mean, and specifically this manifestation of it through the lens of the United States and racial conflicts in the United States, political conflicts in the United States, and basically saying, aha, look, it's all clear. You know, if you support Black Lives Matter, then you are for the Palestinian cause. You are, you know, you will speak out against the genocide, is how, you know, like how it will be phrased and so forth. And I find this all very frustrating because it's just like not everything is the same thing. And whatever you end up thinking about different topics, they're all different topics. And and just this idea that like the people, like I've seen a bunch of stuff about like that the people who are really suffering now are like the people of color. And it's like in the United States, in a lot of contexts, neither Arabs nor Jews are considered people of color. So it's not really it's not getting the categories wrong. You know what I mean? And it seems like it's not helping anybody's understanding of what this conflict is actually about to assume that like it's about race as understood in the United States today. Like, to me, that just seems to be kind of confusing a lot of people. And it seems to be encouraging a lot of people who don't really know much about it to kind of think they do. Anyway.
So I think it comes from the overall critique of Israel as a group of European Jews who came over to an largely Arab environment and like set up their majoritarian Jewish state there.
Well, in what sense were these Jews European? What and by what definition?
That they came from like Russia and Poland and Ukraine.
Geographically, they did do that traveling, yes. What ethnicity were they considered in those locations?
European?
No. I mean, that's the problem, is like they were considered Jewish. Very often they were considered Jewish.
No, okay.
Yeah.
So
I guess what I'm getting at is that
you.
I think it's complicated. And I think that there's this kind of, you can be furious with Israel about any number of things, but if you don't kind of have it clear in your head, like who Jews were, even in Europe, because people will point out, and rightly so, that I guess most at this point Israeli Jews are not of European origin, right?
Right.
But even the ones who are of European origin or partly of European origin, what did that even mean to be European? I think is like something that gets a lot lost in this conversation.
Right. Part of people linking the Palestinian struggle to the indigenous struggle, just as indigenous people around the world are struggling against their descendants of European colonizers, so too are Palestinians struggling against their modern-day European colonizers. You had a recent tweet that I know you wrote about.
Sure. So I'm going to do the absolute coolest thing ever, which is not only to write an article based on my own tweet, but then to podcast about it, because that's the trifecta right there. That's what.
Watch out for the vlog.
Exactly. Basically, so a few weeks ago on Bonjour, we spoke with Professor David Weinfeld about this concept of sort of Jews as settlers in North America, specifically in Canada, and whether that makes sense as a category, specifically for people whose ancestors maybe didn't originally settle Canada and perhaps came under other circumstances, perhaps more tragic circumstances, where they were, people whose ancestors or themselves were refugees, things like that. And I came away from that conversation feeling like, okay, it's pretty clear that like some Jews were specifically settlers of Canada, like back in the day, and that the people where I would feel a little funny about calling them settlers, even though some of them do call themselves settlers, would be like somebody who's, a Syrian refugee. Are they really a settler? That seems a little bit like a strange way to conceptualize things, but Jews, white presenting Jews, whatever, fine. But then I just started thinking about this whole, like, since this war, and I've been thinking more about this, but just this idea of if you divide the whole world into people who are settlers and people, and that in this conception, I'm talking about like a very left-wing conception of settler. So not like the settlements, right?
Yeah.
I'm talking about like, if you live
non-indigenous,
non-indigenous conception, where is a Jew, with the exception of Jews who are indigenous, where is a Jew not a settler? And basically the answer is nowhere. And there used to be this kind of also left-wing way of looking at things and saying that's fine, that Jews don't have a homeland, this sort of anti-Zionist, pro-cosmopolitan way of looking at things. Yeah. Like, it's great for Jews not to have any particular rootedness. That's wonderful.
And we have all these cultures. We have French Jewish, we have Moroccan Jewish,
exactly.
We have all of these.
And isn't it vibrant and delightful? Yes. And I get the appeal of that, but what I'm saying is that it's not lining up with the current stance on the left, where it's like either you're a settler and you should go away and stop gentrifying, invading, occupying wherever you are, or it's your rightful place. And I guess there's just something about this conception of things which seems avoidable. It seems like you can care about indigenous North Americans, you can care about Palestinians, you can care about any number of groups without dividing the world in this way and saying that certain people like shouldn't live where they should just not be. Because like there really is nowhere on earth.
When you say that, are you putting like a normative weight on settler? Is it just a category, indigenous versus non-indigenous? Or is it like someone who did something wrong? Because I feel like in the same way as some people feel like if I say you're a straight white man, that's a normative statement about you that but really I'm just
you're talking about descriptive.
Yeah, I'm just saying like you're not black.
The people who are saying, as one Yale professor was, that no settler is a civilian are the people I'm talking about, and they are not saying this in a neutral sense, because I'm saying that is how this term is now used on much of the left, and that there's a moral that there are the people who deserve to be somewhere and the people who don't. And what you get you get sort of this very performative self-flagellation from like white North Americans sometimes who will be like, yes, it should all go back to indigenous people. They're not doing anything to actually make that happen. It's just like something you can post online and people will be like, yeah, that's great.
I think there's an interesting thing, and I don't know the answer to this, but like, is that the demand of all indigenous people?
So that has come up.
Or is it just, or indigenous people saying like, we would like you to acknowledge like the terrible things that happened to us. We would like equal resources and to like have fresh drinking water. You know,
yes,
we're not saying give us back all the land.
That is what has come up here. The bigger point, to some extent, is like when you're talking about a conflict, talk about that conflict and don't rope in a bunch of other conflicts that may or may not actually have anything to do with it, because things don't just sort of transpose one onto the other. It's not like this group is the exact equivalent of this other group in some other place. Like situations, like I know you're never supposed to say that anything's complicated, because that's saying that you can't ever say anything about anything, which isn't true. But I'm saying that I think to just say, oh, this is a simple situation because it's exactly like this other situation, I don't think you can say that Israel is exactly like any other situation. There's no analogous situation where, there were pre-existing people living somewhere and then this country had to be formed for human rights reasons. Did it have to be formed there? No. But let's say, so here's something that comes up a lot and that I want to ask you about, because I've seen a bunch of this, like where people are sort of, not that there's a whole heck of a lot to do about it now, but saying, well, it was Europe's fault that the Holocaust happened. So really Europe should have done Israel in Europe, right? Shouldn't Israel have been put into Europe? And it's not just that this ignores, like the historical connection of Jews to that specific geographic spot, or, the fact that plenty of Jews already were in the Middle East. But more to the point, like, there would have been people living wherever it was. And would it have been fair even in Germany? Those would have been innocent Germans. And, there would have been German civilians. Let's say Israel had been put there. Well, that would have displaced somebody, right? You bring people in, it's displacing somebody. That's not fair. You know what I mean?
There's this I have to say, the whole discussion to me has this weird, and I know this is going to be provocative, has this weird like blood and soil element to it, of like, we have certain people have certain like connections with a spot, like primordial. I'm like, what the hell do you mean? I look in the mirror. I don't think like there's an Israeli guy. I feel like very connected to a diasporan Jewish culture. Like I said, my dad grew up going to the Spanish and Portuguese shul in Montreal. He's not Spanish or Portuguese, but that's sort of the tunes that he knows. My mom went to Yiddish day school. All the Jewish literature that I know, all the Jewish songs, all the rituals, it all comes out of a diasporan culture, and that sort of cosmopolitan thing that you gestured at before. I don't see Israel as I don't feel indigenous to there. Do you?
Do I feel indigenous to Israel? I mean, I don't feel indigenous to anything. I feel extremely like somebody who could basically live wherever. And I think
a rootless cosmopolitan.
I do. I'm that. I mean, I am, if anybody's that, I am extremely that. My Zionism is really more in the sense of like, if you don't think it's inherently offensive that France is a French country, and I don't mean like solely people of French ancestry living there, which is neither is it true nor should it be true. But if you don't find it offensive that France is French and that's its culture, then I think one country, perhaps with different borders, that is Jewish, with Jewish culture, doesn't strike me as inherently this like ethno-nationalist, horrible, terrible, how could that be thing? And I think that's where I see a double standard playing into it. Now, I don't think that means, that means Israel should, keep its borders as, large as possible and do this and that, and like, vanquish the enemy. No, it's just, I'm saying I don't think that there's I think there is a double standard that enters into it. And people say like, oh, you think every religion should have a country. It's like, well, it's not just a religion, obviously. Like, no, it's a people. And I think the Jewish people do have a country also. And I think that that's something that also gets lost in a lot of the very online conversations where it's like, it's as if everybody's deciding where to put Israel. It's like, well, it was already put. It's been there for quite some time.
Yeah, that's a little bit of Israel is there. Israel is going to continue to be there.
Well, I guess I wonder why people will be angry with us, because I'm sure they will, but I just don't know why. That's also the thing with this conversation. I feel like people are always. I haven't even written or podcasted or tweeted or whatever that much about it, and I still feel like people are always mad at me for unanticipated reasons and from unanticipated perspectives. So always something exciting to wait for on that front.
It is. It's sort of like a surprise, which is sort of nice. Should we move on to our nachas, which is all the more important in a difficult week to find the places that embrace life and things that we can look to feel good in the world.
Yes. Why don't you start, Zach?
Okay, I will start. I have two nachases, two nachasaim. My first piece of nachas is for these two Jewish records. One Kapelia from Raza, and the other Rabbi Deborah Sachs-Mintz's album Yetzirah, which came over the past year, and are the first Jewish religious music to be nominated in the Grammys folk music category. The music is moving and just as accessible, I think, as any other folk music, and I think it fully deserves to be not cordoned off to a religious music category. So big congratulations to Raza and Rabbi Deborah Sachs-Mintz for their inaugural debut in the Grammy Awards. My second nachas, there's been a bunch of stories in the Israeli press about couples who were supposed to have weddings either imminently or soon or were thinking about getting married, and perhaps either one partner is being called up to the reserves, and instead of postponing, they're saying, we're going to have a wedding right now. Let's get the rabbi, neighbor from next door. We'll have a few close friends, whoever's around. We'll just do it. We're going to get married. We're going to embrace life. And I'm taking a lot of pride in people who are able to step in to goodness and not curl up and not postpone and say, we're going to live even more fiercely now. Phoebe, what's up for you?
After that sort of more heartwarming story of people getting married in response to war, or sort of speeding up their marriage.
Make love, not war.
So this is going to still be kind of in that theme. So Jonathan, is it Conricus, the, I don't want to get his bio wrong, former and currently in active duty reserves IDF spokesperson. He posted to that which was once Twitter. I try not to raise my voice during interviews, but I felt the line of questioning by at CBC News here was totally off. We are trying to do the right thing by calling on civilians to evacuate, yet get lectured on humanity. Okay. So there's some clip of him, right, on CBC. On CBC, right? And I remember I was like reading through the replies this got, and it's all very bleak. War, one side, another side, you're wrong, you're a murderer, you're wrong, you're a murderer, all of this. And then somebody in the midst was like, he's hot or something. So I haven't been able to comb through all of these and actually find it, but somebody was like, like,
right.
Look at him. I was like, oh, so then I scrolled back up and obviously, took a look at him. I was like, yeah, okay. that's, always an important, like reminder that we are all still, even in horrible times, human and,
and have desires. And it's all right to have desires.
That's part of being a person. And I think there is sometimes this, I don't want to even say performative because I think it can be real, is that you can just sort of feel overwhelmed by the news and what's in the news and feel like everything else is trivial and nothing else matters. But if somebody on the news is kind of hot, that matters too. It doesn't mean you can't notice what the content of it is. It doesn't mean you have to agree with everything he's saying. It just means, hey,
hey,
that's all.
He's
that's
a cutie.
All it means. Yeah. So that's my nachas is random thirsty posts in the middle of serious discussions about war. Yeah.
And may there be many more on both sides.
Sure,
Hot spokespeople for their causes.
Yeah. Always best that way.
Thank you for listening to Bonjour Chai for the week ending October 21st, Shabbat Parashat Noach. The show is produced and edited by yours truly, Zac Kauffman. Our executive producer is Michael Freeman. Our music is by So Called. We are a project of the Jewish Living Lab and proudly distributed by the CJN Podcast Network. You can drop us a line with your questions, quibbles, queries, or comments at bonjour@thecjn.ca. Thanks for listening.